Hello and welcome to the Business of the Business podcast. I am your co-host, JP John Poz from the Two Man Power Trip. Joining me is my co-host, the wrestling financial genius himself, Mr. Lavie Margolin. Lavie, how you doing today, sir?
Doing great. Obviously 2024, a few episodes in, but our first guest, a very special night. Interestingly, I came across this book called Ballyhoo. I guess on the screen it's reversed right now. Ballyhoo, the roughhousers, con-artists, and wild men who invented professional wrestling. So we welcome the author, Jon Langmead.
Hey guys, thank you so much for having me. Thanks for the invitation. It means a lot, and I appreciate your interest very much.
So whenever we have a guest join us, I have to name drop, build up some credibility and that sort of thing. So being a researcher myself, not to go so far as, your amazing 10 years of research into this book, basically solving the mystery of how did professional wrestling start? When did it, become fake? It may have always been, that sort of thing, which we'll get into. I'm not sure if you ever read his book, Bad Rabbi, but you cited Eddie Portnoy in the book, and I'm not sure if you could see behind me if you recognize.
Look. There's the blimp. I see him.
Yes, Martin the Blimp Levy. So This is Eddie Portnoy, spoke at GCW, which is a Jewish nonprofit in New York, when his book Bad Rabbi came out, and I love event posters and I love wrestling books, obviously. So I finally got this framed, and this is. At least if I'm pointing the camera the right way, the background to our podcast.
Yeah, he was great. I spoke with him about Jack Pfeffer. We did a lot of kind of back and forth because obviously Pfeffer's covered pretty extensively in that section in Bad Rabbi, but he was a huge help with me about exactly when Pfeffer came to America, things like that. So yeah, he was a great resource, and it's a great read for sure.
Now, John, as far as you and wrestling, let's just go back in time just a little before we talk about Ballyhoo. When did you become a fan? Like, what area did you grow up in, and did that have effect on what kind of fan you were? Because to me, always like Northeast is WWF. I mean, it always kind of breaks off that way to me, anyway. So, where'd you grow up, and what were you a fan of?
Yeah, I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland. So I became a fan in 1984. I had kind of marked it at one point because I can really specifically remember seeing on TV the night Barry Windham. There was a replay. I remember coming across it on a Saturday afternoon of the match when Barry Windham and Mike Rotunda beat Iron Sheik and Nikolai Volkov for the tag team titles. And I can't explain what it was because I had seen wrestling before that, I think. But that match just really hooked me, and I was just really into the U.S. Express. And I was, I think, 8, 9 maybe at the time, something like that. So got pretty interested in that. But in Baltimore, we were really fortunate because we actually, from my memory, we got more of Mid-Atlantic wrestling. We got it kind of mixed with the stuff coming from New York. And then we would even occasionally get stuff like World Class. If you were like randomly flipping around 12:30 at night, you might catch a broadcast of World Class. Because I think a lot of the promotions at that time were really competing. Baltimore was like kind of a city they were all sort of kind of jockeying for position in. So we were kind of lucky at that time. Different things would come on and off TV, UWF, stuff like that. You'd catch it occasionally. So I just became really hooked. And I think the thing that did it for me, I wrote a little bit about this for Slam Wrestling, was the wrestling magazines. I got really interested in those, the kind of what's known as after magazines now. I call them Weston magazines, but they're after magazines for sure too. But I got really, really interested in those. All, Inside Wrestling, the Pro Wrestling Illustrated, The Wrestler, all of them. And I mean, I would buy those religiously. So between those and, the weekly broadcasts, which was all we got. We didn't have cable. If you had cable, you could get even more. But my parents wouldn't let us get it. But, you could get the whole story kind of between all those. And I loved it. I mean, for 5 or 6 years, it was really my whole life. So
when you like dive into wrestling, like you're loving it, when did you start writing? Was that just at a young age as well? And was it anything to do with wrestling when you first started getting into the writing aspect of things?
The writing, I didn't really even start. If I cough, excuse me, I'm getting over a cold here. But if the writing didn't really come along until a lot later. And I got interested in music, maybe as a sophomore in high school, and got pretty deep into playing drums and just really being interested in music. And that was where writing really started with music. But the writing about wrestling really got started maybe 12 years ago. I just got really interested, maybe like a lot of guys my age who kind of watched wrestling and then stopped for a long time, got kind of interested in it again. I was curious, does it hold up, or does it still hold any interest for me? But for me, it really became a lot about like, what is this thing? Where did it come from? Who are these people? Like, what was all this? And there was kind of so much you could find on the internet about it. So I kind of went down that rabbit hole, but got really lucky enough to write a long piece that was up on the website Pop Matters about the history of the Western magazines. And I tracked down the writers for that and spent about a year tracking all those guys down and doing a whole long history of the magazines and how they wrote it. And what I call it kind of at the time, creative journalism, how they kind of took something that was sort of, real, which was in and of itself, had all these other tentacles, but then they kind of also then crafted this whole fictional world off of that. So that was how I got into writing specifically about wrestling. And then it just kind of went from there. And I started writing with Greg Oliver and Slam, and it just went from there.
What about this book, Ballyhoo? I mean, was that something? Because I think, if I remember correctly, it took you 10 years to write it, right?
It did. I mean, between all the research and writing and all of it, and just draft after draft after draft. Yeah, it took about 10 years writing, somewhere around there. It was definitely at least 5 or 6 years of kind of starting and stopping and things like that. So yeah, it was a fair amount of work.
When you're doing that and doing the book, are you making a lot of connections? Who are you getting some help from? How are you doing this? It's just as far as a historian aspect is concerned.
Yeah, no, good question. Thanks for asking, because in the acknowledgments, it was something I was really wanted to be kind of make sure I highlighted was I think if the book has any, whatever factual accuracy it has, I think is owed to the fact that I did make so many great connections with so many historians. I mean, I'm sure I'll forget some people, but guys like Steve Yohe, I mentioned Greg Oliver, Steve Johnson, Mark Hewitt, Tim Hornbaker, some of those guys people may know, some of them they don't. But I mean, there's a reasonably small community of guys, and they are mostly guys. There may be some women. I didn't actually meet any female historians. There might be some, but that are studying this. I mean, and really, it's going match by match and looking throughout from as far back as you can go, really from the 1860s and 70s, and building out these long match results city by city, and kind of looking at title changes and going through the newspapers. And, obviously in the old days it was by hand. Now people can kind of do it much, much faster. But I mean, sitting at the microfilm carols, just going article by article, and making notes and things like that. But I was able to connect with all of them, and have these really fantastic and long conversations. And each of them were really willing to share information. Not a single one of them was reticent at all. It was really, and I'll say this over and over, but it was one of the best experiences of my life. It was so fun. They were all so great to talk to and work with. And they loved talking about this stuff. It was really, really the best. And I was so specific about trying to get stuff right, because I think I wanted to do right by them. And that was one of my biggest priorities.
Now, Ballyhoo, the roughhousers, con artists, and wild men who invented pro wrestling. Any surprises in there, like as you're finding out the true history of wrestling?
Yeah, I mean, I hope I did capture the true history of wrestling. The surprises, I think what surprised me when I was getting into it, and I guess it's what interested me in it, was how early in the process the matches pretty much look exactly like a match from 1986, something like that. That you can look at a match in 1917 and it sounds an awful lot like the matches we were watching, in the 1980s. And obviously there's some differences, and there's some of the characters might be a little more exaggerated, some of the moves might be a little different, but the basic core idea is kind of all there already by 19. And it doesn't, I don't think it really changes all that much. This idea that I think, Jack Pfeffer exposed the business in the 1930s, and the fans all believe 100% of it's true. You know, I'm pretty skeptical of that. There's obviously not, I can't prove it, but I think the book certainly goes to show, you know, the newspapers were talking pretty openly about questioning, you know, how much of this stuff was maybe prearranged. And I don't, and you know, I'm certainly not saying wrestling's fake. You know, I have no interest in that stuff, but you know, I think we all kind of obviously know there's some prearrangement that goes on and there's some exaggeration that goes on and things like that. But that just makes me kind of love it more. So I think this idea that these guys, even in the 1915s, 15, 16, 17, were kind of like coming up with these creative endings and, you know, hey, you turn it down, you know, go down and bend over to tie your shoe and I'm going to run over and pin you real quick. You know, it's just like, it was amazing to me, you know? So that really was, I think, surprised me and was what got me so interested in kind of digging into this even more.
What made you want to do it just to begin with, like to really analyze it? Did you really want to learn the true history of wrestling, just, you know, going all the way back when?
Yeah, I think that I think I knew I wanted to write something about wrestling. I mean, you know, a lot of guys write books about it. It was something I liked writing. And I love wrestling, and I thought, you know, maybe there's something here. But the question was, is there an angle that hasn't been covered to death already? You know, in all the books that are out there, you know, there's plenty of books. So for me, it was just looking around for a lot of time was spent just looking around. You know, I would have loved to have written about the territories. You know, that's something I love, this 50s and up into that period of time, and but this idea of like the conflict between the promoters was really compelling. You know, that's really obviously compelling in the 1980s. All the stuff going on there between Jim Crockett and Vince McMahon. But anyways, you go back, you really see it up in the 1910s, in the 1920s, in the 1930s. The conflicts are there, and the conflicts are probably 10 times more, you know, pronounced and aggressive than even they were back when we think of like the Monday Night Wars or something. I mean, they were way more cutthroat back in the 1930s, you know,
Mafioso style. Big time.
Yeah, exactly. To some degree. Yeah.
Now let me hand it over to Lavie. I know he's got a lot of good questions.
Yeah, I have my fingers like in different pages of the book. I guess I should have put tabs or something like that, but as I'm figuring it out. So uniquely, one of the things that you didn't shy away from in the book was the early intertwined history with boxing. I feel like most, and let me know if that's a stretch, most pro wrestling historical books, they move through that very quickly. If they touch on it at all, maybe they assume, well, our audience doesn't want to read about this, so we won't acknowledge it, so we'll just move on. Did you make a conscious effort to say that, yes, I mean, it's hard to know what the page count will be, but it's a 240-page book plus a lot of citation, that I'm willing to give X% to boxing because that's the story?
Yeah, wow, good question, and thanks for asking that. It was funny. My reader was along the way was my mom, and I would send her, you know, pages, and I'd say, hey, what do you think? And we'd go back and forth a little bit. And one of her comments early on was about, you know, the boxing timeline was a little confusing, you know, because there was way more boxing in early drafts. And the reason I had to include it, I just didn't know a way around it. And I think the more that I settled on Jack Curley as the central figure, then, I mean, it was basically like my kind of grave was dug, because it was just like he had such a heavy hand in boxing. I couldn't avoid it, and I had to go into more detail than even maybe some people would prefer. So it was a risk, you know. I don't know. For wrestling fans, hopefully I didn't go into too much boxing, but I do think, and I had read this early on when I think it was maybe Dave Meltzer talked a little bit about this, and certainly Steve Yohe, if you all know who he is, it's something he talks a lot about. Is there sort of this kind of connection between the two's popularity early on, that as boxing would experience these big peaks in popularity, wrestling would decline. And then the inverse was true too, is that when boxing would really go into decline for one reason or another, it tended to either coincide or whatever with pro wrestling's going through these really increased times of popularity. So, you know, you just couldn't avoid it. I mean, something like the obviously the Jess Willard Jack Johnson fight. I mean, there was some debating there. Like, God, I had a whole chapter. I'm not sure, are people going to just get lost here? The Jack Johnson. God, I'm blanking on his fight, on his name right this second, but the fight in 1910 in Nevada with Jack Johnson, you know, those were things you just couldn't avoid. And I did just try to quote unquote maybe solve that, the idea with the two parts. I think by the time the book gets to the second part, boxing is really pretty much left behind. Jack Curley's pretty much moved directly into pro wrestling. And I kind of personally think, and maybe this is a book for another time for somebody to write, boxing very consciously tried to separate itself from wrestling. I think it didn't want to be seen as it saw the direction wrestling was going in, and it didn't want to go in that direction. That's my personal opinion. I don't know. Sports historians can certainly correct me on that one.
So with Jack Curley, who's, if I'm pronouncing this correctly, Jacques Schuel, a French Jew, we'll save the BuzzFeed headline of saying the Vince McMahon of the early 20th century, but I don't think even our depth readers or listeners are familiar with that, you know, by the book, first of all, but like sort of like, who is this person?
Yeah, so Jack Curley, born Armand Chul in San Francisco in 1868, 78, I forget now, 74, I forget. God, it's been a minute since I've done some of these research and looked at some of these numbers. But yeah, I mean, he was a sports and eventually entertainment promoter in the early 1900s that really, in my opinion, I think without him, professional wrestling wouldn't potentially have survived. I mean, I think most famously, people listening will certainly know the 1911 match between George Hackenschmidt and Frank Gotch, and Jack Curley was responsible for that match. And then he really tried to make wrestling a national sport the way that boxing was, with the single, you know, heavyweight champion and sort of recognized contenders, and to organize it in the way that Vince McMahon eventually would come along and organize it. But it was, I think, something he really cared a lot about doing, and it just sort of eluded him his entire life. But you know, he was responsible for organizing it in the mid, probably most popular, I think, in his greatest time of success was the late 1910s, when you've got guys like Ed Lewis and Jim Landis and Joe Secker and the Zabisco brothers touring nationally and sort of exchanging the heavyweight championship between each other at different points around the country. And I mean, they were drawing sellout crowds across the country, and they were minting money with pro wrestling at that time. But he was responsible for organizing that and making all that happen. And by the time he died in 1937, he was, like you said, the Vince McMahon of wrestling, and I think synonymous with wrestling.
So while there was questions about sort of the legitimacy of pro wrestling, I think one of the points where sort of like, this is theater, this is show, was this tournament or this sort of like residency in an opera house in New York, where there was this character that emerged called the Masked Marvel that was really a phenomenon. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, the 1915 Manhattan Grand Opera House tournament began in 1915, ran into early 1916. It was put on by a guy named Samuel Rockman, who came and went from wrestling in really about the course of a year or so in America, but had really an outsized influence on it. He was a German immigrant and got himself established in what would have been, I think at the time, like Yiddish theater, but turned to promoting professional wrestling for some reason. We don't really even know why. There's no information, very little information really on it. But I think he promoted at least 2 tournaments, one in the summer, and then he did the one in the fall that became really famous. And it was Greco-Roman wrestling. And it was held over a couple months in this Grand Opera House, which is a building in New York that held a couple thousand people, and he rented it for several months at a time to put this tournament on. And night after night, and it was very consciously designed for like a theater going crowd. So people would be coming in tuxedos and, you know, evening gowns for a night of pro wrestling. And it was treated as kind of a serious thing, but it was really mixed. I mean, even if you read the newspaper reports at the time, there was stuff that was clearly kind of comical. It was meant for comic relief. There was stuff that was kind of meant to be more serious, things like that. So he clearly had a sense of how to kind of pace a night of pro wrestling. And this is all happening, you know, just on a theater stage with two guys on a mat, you know, on the theater stage. They put that out there. But yeah, at some point towards the end, attendance is lagging. People have gotten bored of watching this thing night after night. And out of nowhere comes this character, the Masked Marvel, which, you know, is a guy wearing a black hood. A lot of people might be familiar with this, but really captivates people for a couple weeks with this mystery of who he is. And of course, he's defeating all of these people who otherwise couldn't lose in the past. And he's come and somehow magically he's beating them all, you know, and he's got this mask and refuses to be kind of unmasked and tell reporters who he is, but it drives people nuts for a couple of weeks. And he was a real sensation until eventually reporters, it didn't take him too long, but they figured out who he was. And some people say, and I think it's not really true. It's pretty close to being true, but that he was the first masked wrestler in America. God, do they even have masked wrestlers anymore? Do people still do that?
Well, you have Rey Mysterio, more like lucha.
Okay. It's a lucha. It's more of a lucha thing. Yeah.
I think in like sort of like challenger brands or whatever, the NWA still does it, but it's like a little bit awkward when they do it. It doesn't exactly hit right, but like when it comes to lucha, it's like accepted.
It's acceptable. So there's no more masked superstars. I mean, every promotion had masked wrestlers in the 1980s, even, you know, up until like the 1980s or so. But you know, it was sort of this kind of device that you would see over and over. And he wasn't the first, but he was certainly one of the first in America. And then there had been masked wrestlers in Europe before, at least a couple of them that would show up in different countries and have similar effects, and they were used in similar ways. So I think it was something Rockman was aware of, and probably an idea that he borrowed for the tournament, and it worked great.
So recently I was walking down, I live in New York, and I was walking, not for the first time, past the Hippodrome. And I was like, oh, is this the Hippodrome? And like, you know, I Googled it. I was like, it is the Hippodrome, which isn't there anymore, but you have a parking garage and, you know, a building on top of it or whatever. I don't know much about it. And you had a quick reference where you sort of referenced that things weren't going so well at that point in Madison Square Garden. So wrestling transitioned to the Hippodrome. Can you give like a little bit of color, like of what the significance of that venue? I don't know if you know the capacity offhand, a little bit about it.
No, that's a great question. And you're referring to kind of like 36, 37, because Jack Curley, I think, but yeah, he, by that point, just to make sure we're talking about the same thing. Yeah. So Jack Curley was really the established promoter in New York. And, you know, for my take, it was all about, and I think this is the exact same thing, even in the 1980s, when you read about, you know, Vince McMahon running the regional promoters out of business. It was the same thing, you know, getting access to these arenas and locking them up under contract, things like that. But he was running wrestling out of Madison Square Garden at that point for the most part. And he would occasionally use some smaller arenas around the city. But when wrestling had really kind of hit the skids by, you know, 1936, then going into 1937, he was kind of bringing back for another season. He had moved out of Madison Square Garden, was moving into this venue, the Hippodrome. I don't know that much about it, to be honest with you. I did at one point, and I know I had researched it, but I know it's definitely smaller than Madison Square Garden. And the issue with Madison Square Garden too, I think, is that it was very expensive to get the lease on that. Basically, the promoters would front, you know, whatever amount of money was required to, you know, lease a Monday night there, right? They'd have to pay up front $2,000 or whatever it was. And then they would make it back against the ticket sales, but he clearly didn't think that was a good risk anymore. So he would do this. And you'd see this throughout the 20s and 30s, where he would kind of, these boom and bust cycles where he'd be in Madison Square Garden, then he'd go into a smaller arena for a year or two, build it back up, go into Madison Square Garden, have a run. And this was, I think, what he was expecting to do again. And if he had his way, he'd have eventually made it back to Madison Square Garden by 1940, you know, if he could have, but he obviously died before then.
So actually, that's an interesting transition point to a sort of a broader question I was thinking about was, everyone always says that wrestling is cyclical, and it's really amazing to see some of the references here. You know, from early 20th century, wrestling has become too theatrical. Wrestling is dead in New York. And then a little bit later on, you see different themes like almost like less of like the pro wrestling theme emerging during this pro wrestling era, but more like early days of UFC where you had these fights. They were super long, not to the same degree as they were in the 20th century, but like they went on hours. There was no real resolution, maybe more like some of the early UFC draws. And also what I was absolutely fascinated by as a Goldberg fan was that Goldberg actually had a run in the 1930s, but we didn't realize it. So like, what does that teach us? And if you want to talk a little bit about that Goldberg illusion.
Oh, well, yeah, the Goldberg illusion is the guy I think I loved more than anybody else. And the reason I probably wanted to write the book more than anything was Gus Sonnenberg, Dynamite Gus Sonnenberg, who had a brief and tumultuous run as the most famous wrestler in the country, starting in about 1928. Similar to Goldberg, was a football player, right? And tell me if I'm getting this wrong. But Goldberg was a football player, and he used a move similar to Goldberg with this football tackle style thing that he did. And people had never seen anything like that at 1928, and they loved Gus Sonnenberg. And he was famous before. He had come from a team called the Providence Steamrollers. He was famous in college when he was played for Dartmouth. Well-known athlete, well-known legitimate professional athlete in football, and then he makes his transition to wrestling. One of the first big guys to do that. I mean, there had been other football players and things, but he really was the one that I think got that wave going. And then you'll see nothing but football players coming in to pro wrestling, right? I mean, there's tons of them, and they're all doing the football tackle, just like Gus Sonnenberg did. Now, and he ended up having a run where undefeated, and it was this national phenomenon of Gus Sonnenberg, 30, 40, 50 matches, whatever it was that he ended up having. He won the world championship from Ed Lewis. There's a whole long arc I won't go into, but basically, you know, reporters followed him around and kind of exposed him what was going on with some of his matches. His kind of run came to an end. They didn't hit him with a cattle prod, but his run did eventually come to an end. Although he had a pretty good career, you know, up until the end. You know, he wasn't sort of, you know, exposed and kicked to the side. He continued to wrestle up until his death in whatever year it was, 1947, whatever year it was he died.
So in terms of the publication journey, you're published through an academic press, and, you know, as an author and an author myself, sort of, if somebody poses the question like, who did you choose to publish with? It's sort of like the answer is whoever would take me, right? You know, like, which is anyone that is an amazing opportunity. But like, was there a conscious effort to say like, I'm going to focus on an academic press? I think that's a better fit for me than, and not meaning to shade anyone, just talking about, let's say, a better fit for me than ECW press, just for example. Like, did it just happen? Like, what was that process like?
It just happened, you know. I contacted ECW Press, and for anybody who doesn't know, ECW Press publishes a lot of pro wrestling books. I mean, they were obviously the first ones on my list, just because I knew they published pro wrestling books. I mean, you don't see a lot of publishers publishing books about pro wrestling, really, and certainly not about. A friend of mine joked once, you know. Not only do people not read books about pro wrestling, he's like, you're writing about, you know, the 1910s. He's like, who's going to read that? And it's like, oh, geez, he might be right. But you know, and the university press, it just kind of came together. University of Missouri was interested. I had submitted the proposal to them because they have this series on sports and culture that they're working on, and they loved the proposal. And so I wanted to get it out there. I think I knew an academic press would do a good job. I think they would, you know, they're going to keep it in press. They're going to keep it out there for people. It's going to be available. And they were the best. I mean, they were so great to work with. I think people sometimes don't go with them for different reasons, because it's like the money, I think, is a little different. Obviously, if you get a trade publication, sometimes you can get money up front, things like that. You know, had I been able to go with a gigantic publisher, you know, maybe, I don't know, was not a problem I had to worry about. or a decision I had to make, but I couldn't be happier with the university, and they were fantastic. And it was a rigorous process. It was read by different reviewers, and I think for me that actually took a lot of kind of relief off of me, because I was like, okay, other people are reading this, other people are seeing that this might be legitimate. People that are looking at this from the kind of a historical eye, a sports history eye, cultural history eye, and they're giving me feedback about it along the way. So I was happy in that process, and I couldn't be happier going with them, and I think they did a great job. So, yeah.
So last question for me before I turn over to John was that being a business podcast, so the answer doesn't have to be yes, but my feeling was that you weren't necessarily focused solely on, the artistry of it, let's say like Hackenschmidt's appeal to the masses, but more, which is tied into it, but more of like business is really driving this book because it's promoters, it's the money that they're making, and that's the engine that keeps the machine going. Is that sort of somewhat of a fair theory?
No, I would agree with that, and I think to pull kind of the thread a little more too, I would say something's again. I keep going back to Steve Yohe, but I mean, my conversations with these historians was so kind of illuminating. There was something he said to me about, the reason they go and they look at match by match by match by match by match. You look, it's hundreds and hundreds of matches, and they'll get the results for them from town to town. And he's like, that's how you can tell who was going over with the fans, and where they were going over. You might win in, Kenosha, but then you lose, 3 nights later in Des Moines. Why? Well, Des Moines might have been more of a Stanislaus Zabisco town, but that's how because we're never obviously going to go back and be able to get this information. And there's no, Rosetta Stone out there that has all of it. But the information is in the results, and you have to go town by town. So they've spent their life doing it. And, I've certainly benefited from the work they did. And I was able to kind of build on that because I didn't have to go through town by town because they have that information. But that's why. And that's how in the days before, obviously information was shared in minutes. You knew the results from somewhere. Nobody knew what the heck happened. If a match was coming into San Francisco, nobody knew what they'd done a couple days ago in some other town. Now, for the big matches, they did, obviously. I mean, some of those made the newspaper, but the business was what drove it. And the people that could bring, the wrestlers that could bring, and the matches that could bring people out was who was going to get the push. I mean, it hasn't changed, I don't think, at all. I really don't think. And the push, they got it back then too. They got the good matches. They got the good matches in the good cities. They got the good headlines. They got the great stories written about it in newspapers and things like that. So I think that was the equivalent of the push back then.
As far as Ballyhoo, where could everybody get it? And just give us one last push of why they should get it as well.
Yeah, they can get it. Hopefully anywhere you get books has it. I couldn't recommend it highly enough. You can go to Amazon. You can go to bookstore.org. I'm sure if you go to your local retailer, they can order it for you as well. Yeah, I mean, for a push, I will say, my goal was, I think it's a unique book. I don't think this book has been written, in the way I kind of tried to approach it. Certainly you can get Fall Guys. There's other books that are certainly out there about this era that are great. I'll make a plug for Steve. Steve Yohe has a fantastic book on Ed Strangler Lewis that I would absolutely recommend. I think the thing I tried to do that maybe hadn't been done before was really string this kind of narrative arc through it and tell the story, and hopefully what's an engaging way and is a fun read and hopefully an informative read. And hopefully it can kind of shine some new context on it for people. And hopefully that's what I did.
All right, John, thank you so much for all the time. Really appreciate it. Great stuff.
You are. Thanks for your time. Oh, and I wanted to tell you before I hang up real quick, I appreciated your commentary on the Iron Claw from last week. It never, John, I think it never once occurred to me that was Kevin's, almost Kevin's fantasy of his brothers reuniting. And I will say, when you said that, I thought, damn, because that scene struck me so sort of wrong. But then I thought, I bet you're right. That probably was exactly what was intended there. So I appreciated that very much.
John had the same effect on me.
Hey, sometimes you have to have a different look at it, and
Yes.
that's what I think. Anyway, that's what I think they were going for.
I think you're right about that for sure. All right, y'all. Thanks for your time. Have a great rest of the night.
Take
And thanks
care.
for having
Thank
me.
you, John. You
Bye.
too. Lavie, let's get to the news. What is going on with little S and P, the global status, the
Yes.
global stats?
So it's, whenever these gigantic media financial analysis occurs, you always have to stand up and pay a little bit of attention to it. So I don't have it as a comparison point right now, but they had dropped on us one looking at the Chinese market around the new year, and then suddenly I got in my results the American market. So just a few touch points. I think Brandon Thurston might seemed intrigued by this research, so he might pick it up in one of his podcasts soon. But percentage of online households in the U.S. that view selected sports. So pro wrestling, of this list of sort of major or semi-major sports, pro wrestling is the lowest. It doesn't mean it's the lowest sport, because there's a number of sports that aren't ranked at all here. But for example, 8% of households in the US view pro wrestling, 9% motorsports, 10% combat sports, ice hockey 16%, and then obviously basketball, baseball, and football 30, 32, and 52%. So just a little bit of perspective on that. The age of viewers for pro wrestling, 18 to 24, is 10% of viewers. So that's somewhat consistent with some of the others. Where it begins differing is that for pro wrestling, 21% are between the ages of 25 and 34. That compares to just 10% in motorsports, and 24%, so somewhat similarly, in combat sports. 27% and 22% are 50 plus. So as you'd imagine, a sport like golf has a lot of older viewers. 60% are that 45 plus. I can't believe I'm almost in that category, 45 plus, when we think about older viewers. How does that compare to combat sports? Combat sports, right? It's only basically a mainstream sport or semi-mainstream for the last 30 years. So their viewership is not very old. So one could think about combat sports as possibly growing as the viewership gets older. No surprises, this is long thought about, that pro wrestling earnings by household, 43%, and this is by far the large. Well, it actually compares to combat sports. So TKO has this market down. Less than 50% earnings, 50,000 earnings per household. 37% is between 50 and 99,000 per year, and 100,000 or more is 18%. So the lowest amount of those earning 100,000 per year, that's off, like when we heard about Fox not renewing SmackDown, right? You couldn't get the same ad rates. And then they looked at percentage of households that view certain leagues. So this was interesting in that the WWE, let's see, where did it go? Was about, 6% of, so it's interesting, 8% of households view pro wrestling in the broader context, 6% view WWE, 4% view AEW, and 1% view New Japan. So I don't know if they didn't ask about certain leagues, because, for example, Impact, when we think about Access TV, right, they have a much larger viewership now than New Japan. So this might take into account online viewing, streaming viewing, and so on.
Man, it seems like pro wrestling fans maybe skewing between 35 and 44, maybe the most, but they seem like they're not very affluent as far as money made. But the people that are watching not necessarily have the most money.
Yeah, it's always been the perception, I guess, the reality here. I think, and this is sort of, this is just a theory. Pro wrestling is one of those sports or forms of entertainment that also appeals very much to immigrant families, meaning that those that may have been newly arrived to the U.S. We often hear those stories anecdotally of viewing pro wrestling. So it doesn't mean that those families won't get there, right? Like sometimes it takes another generation to grow wealth, but a lot of people, like, you know, as they're learning English, like it's a very visual form of entertainment. They find themselves connecting to pro wrestling. So that, I don't think that solves the answer, but that might be a little bit of it. Also, like, you know, truth be told, you know, wealth and education and so on, like, I don't know if I want my son watching pro wrestling, you know, that much. Like, I've shown him some of the funnier stuff of, like, you know, earthquakes squashing people and so on, but like sometimes people that are like, you know, approaching society in a certain way, like when it's violence, they don't necessarily want to expose their children to that, whereas sometimes people that aren't so worried about it, you know. So if that makes sense. So so that might be a theory. I'm just throwing some ideas out there. Some people might end up roasting me for these ideas, but just a couple of theories to throw out there.
Now, as far as wrestling in general, right now, it seems like it is going through, I wouldn't say boom period. Let's not go crazy. It's not Attitude Era. It's not Hogan Era, but, you know, it is definitely picking up steam for sure. Business is picking up, as Jim Ross used to say. What's going on with the big weekend for some challenger brands and some of the independents? Because it was a huge weekend.
Yes. So, you know, even going back less than a week since we taped the last show, it was sort of like, okay, Impact, they're starting to sell a lot of tickets, and New Japan is too. And before it seemed a little bit slow, we were talking about on the show, can any brand sell 2,000 tickets anymore? And we got the answer that yes. So Ali Katch, who's, you know, best known for GCW, but really a star in the independent scene, captured it well in a tweet. Packed show for Rise, sold out Freelance, sold out First, actually 2 sold out shows. Packed GCW, 2 shows that weekend. New Japan and TNA and tons of other shows happening. We're so lucky. So it's an amazing weekend that we're referring to here. Triller had a survey which just included New Japan, TNA, and AEW, but they said, what are you watching? And there was almost 1,500 respondents. 43% said TNA, so that might show, like, okay, of people that are following something like Fight or Triller, like, what are they responding to? 26% said AEW, and 12.5% said New Japan.
As far as TNA is concerned, they did have a big weekend. Tell us about Hard to Kill, because it seemed like that was a big moneymaker for them.
They had an amazing weekend, and it continues into the week. And amazingly, John, I don't think they actually followed through on any amazing surprise. I don't know what they meant by one of their biggest signings. Was it Nick Nemeth? Or, I'm not sure. Like,
yeah, I guess it was Ziggler. Yeah, I guess because nobody else was. Well, I guess Dana Brooke, but that's not the big one. I think it was Dolph Ziggler.
Yeah, and I didn't want to insult anyone's gimmick, but is Dana Brooke copying the AEW gimmick of, like, Timeless Tony Storm, or maybe she's just dressed like that now?
I'm not really sure. I think that's just what she's going for. I'm not. Her name is Ash by Elegance, so I'm not sure what she's going for. But interested. I'm intrigued.
Time will tell. So,
yeah,
or Timeless will tell. No. So first of all, they did really well on their attendance. So. And this also goes to show, like, it's sort of like setting expectations, meaning not necessarily that TNA is setting expectations low, but they're doing a good job of booking the right venues, right? Because 1630 for AEW, they would get eviscerated, which sometimes they do. But as the ticket sales picked up, and I don't even think they used the full palms to do this, like, that was a win. Len Asper, the CEO of Anthem, called it a sellout and a record gate. They had expanded tickets there. Actually, WrestleTix had it as a potential max capacity for the venue of 2071. And WrestleTix said, much credit to TNA and New Japan for selling a lot of tickets late and never budging on price either. I think both pick perfect size venues at the moment. I wish we could see more of these type of weekends in the near future where so many promotions are running at once to near capacity. TNA should make running theaters this size a habit. I loved how it looked and always thought wrestling would look good in this environment. Again, more from Len Asper. Finally, the wait is over. The stage is set, sold out, record gate, adding more seats every hour. And around the world, people are assembling. And they're going to get even more than they paid for. What else? So TNA also, a lot of people are like, didn't they have a relationship already or whatever? But our friend from two-time guest on this podcast, Dorian Roldan, was on the show, and they reaffirmed their relationship with TNA, or maybe announced it as a new partnership, whatever it may be. So I think that's a win-win for both brands. AAA, I think, would struggle right now to sell tickets on its own in America, and sort of like they're figuring out their mix and connecting with brands like TNA and possibly getting a fee when their talent come is a really smart idea. Then even possibly more impressively is to get a strong gate for a television taping the day after a pay-per-view. Even like Ring of Honor at its hottest under Sinclair brand, like the second day would just be difficult. Even like Young Bucks, I think there was once like a double shot in Massachusetts, and the second day they're like giving away a DVD or something, and there was still, and maybe like I remember another double shot where like Samoa Joe actually returned to the promotion, and it didn't help because people were just tired by the second day. Here they did really well. Snake Eyes, I know that, I think Okada was in for that show specifically, and They did $11.99, so that might be part of the draw there. A near, relatively near sellouts, in that regard.
Hey, you were doubting Okada. He sold out the Battle in the Valley for New Japan, and he sold out Snake Eyes here for TNA, or almost sold it out. So hey, we can't knock Okada. But while I'm talking about Battle of the Valley, tell us about New Japan.
Yeah, and I will admit to my mistakes. Maybe this is the third one. So here are my all times. All In, I doubted originally, but when it was more Cody Rhodes talking about Ring of Honor doing 10,000 seats, I doubted the move from the fairgrounds to the Municipal Auditorium for Ric Flair's last match, and here Okada. So maybe not as bad when you think about it like that, but. So New Japan. Okay, so one more thing with Impact, which I didn't put in the notes, and actually was just breaking as we were recording, that they're having a really good week. They signed a deal with Star Times, I believe is the name, in Africa, which includes South Africa, but also 30 countries in Africa for distribution. We've talked about in the past some of their struggles with like, not necessarily a struggle, but like the lack of exposure over like cable or more mainstream distribution as opposed to just digital distribution. So I think that's a good win for them. But back to New Japan, total sellout 2145. Lots of buzz for that in the building, and a relatively quick start. Actually, I didn't grab the newest screenshot, but their show in the Wintrust Arena in Chicago has already exceeded, I believe, 2,300 tickets sold, if I remember correctly. So they're already surpassed what they did in Long Beach. The challenge for them is that it's a very big venue, right? So are they going to get past 3,500, 4,000, and so on? Let's see what they do, because a few years ago, and when they were, I would say, a hotter brand, Cicero Stadium, I think it was up to 3,000 tickets that they had sold in that iteration. So maybe one would say that would be a better choice. But here they're off to a pretty hot start, and it's several months away.
Wonder who they're going to get for that. I know Mustafa Ali, but he's not like the guy that's going to put him over the top. I just wonder who they're going to add to that show. Like, would it be a Danielson? Maybe Moxley, throw him on there. Mercedes Moné, if possibility. So I wonder who they're going to put on there just to put them over the top.
Yeah, they're picking up, I guess, the names that they can that are out there. And Mustafa Ali, on a smaller scale, Fightful was reporting and speaking to the different promoters, maybe Brett Lauderdale and some other people that that he's helped with ticket sales to different degrees, and we're seeing it with like the other promotions that are saying sell out, sell out. An interesting point from Mustafa Ali, and not to get too down the road in terms of politics and identity and so on. Like one of the things that he said, which I totally believe would come from allegedly like WWE or wherever it came from. Like somebody would say like, "Oh, no one will cheer for somebody named Mustafa Ali," and it made me think the name doesn't sound so different from Muhammad Ali. I think a lot of people cheered for him. So not to discount that point and that challenge that he had in wrestling, but it's certainly not unprecedented. People will certainly cheer for who they like.
No doubt. What is going on with GCW?
So a very hot weekend for GCW as well. Chicago and Columbus. They were pretty packed out, these venues. We know Chicago was a sellout even with the threat of a storm. I'm not sure in the end what happened, but everything worked out well there. Columbus did really well too, and this is the perfect type of venues for GCW in terms of regular shows. I would say like even New York, as I talked about, in Brooklyn, like that. Like one tier theater type of venue. It looks great on television. The fans are on top of the action. You can't always get that, but I think that sort of thing works really well. They announced the Collective, off to a very hot start in terms of a small venue. I think it's at a catering hall, whatever that means. It can mean a lot of things, but the first 3 rows in terms of a package were sold out. I know Joey Janela's Spring Break is always one of the hottest shows. The first show sold out, then the Cluster F is doing very well as well. Effie's show is doing really well. So, but also spotlighting, like when we talk about momentum, Tampa is 6 rows deep already, and that's a good number for GCW. Dallas is looking really good. In Arizona, it's probably sold out by the time you read this as well. So as we talked about, like how is GCW pointing? It's now, pointing definitely an upward trajectory.
What is going on with the Premier streaming network? And should we be worried about anything?
Yeah, we loved having them as guests on the show, and I am worried about them. I mean, not necessarily of Freddie Prinze Jr. I think he'll be fine one way or another, but these bumps in the road, which we've referred to about a few weeks ago as well, it doesn't give me confidence in their long-term stability. And this is probably, if this relaunch doesn't work, my speculation, my guess would be this is probably will be it for them. Directly from an email from PSN. So this is our friends at PW Ponderings. We've been covering so many things tonight. Just a reminder that we're the official business podcast of PW Ponderings, and an interesting piece that they covered. And this is from that directly. So go check it out on their website. They have ended their current app and will be launching a new app soon as the premier wrestling app in the first quarter of 2024. Here are the details. What to expect: seamless content transition. Your favorite premier streaming content will become part of the new wrestling app, ensuring you'll have access to classic events and new shows. Enhanced features. Enjoy features such as social connectivity, dedicated arenas, centralized news hub, exclusive merchandise. Will be free. While some premium events will remain pay-per-views, our commitment is to provide you with a dynamic, engaging, accessible platform without the need for a subscription. Continue access to the library. In the meantime, you'll get their content on YouTube. So free, the free model didn't work so well for Pro Wrestling TV. I see that they have some upsell capabilities here, but I don't know. The challenge that I've always seen with them has been like the lack of an anchor promotion, one that like a GCW that drives, or at least drives the pro wrestling side of Triller TV. IWTV has its Beyond and its weekly program as well from Massachusetts, but Premiere, I don't think, has ever found that anchor. They've just had a lot of good content, but there's a lot of ways to access good content today in pro wrestling. So rooting for them, but concerning that you have to do like this much of a pivot this early in the launch.
As far as some indie quick hits, tell us what's going on, even with our buddy Kevin Kleinrock. What's going on in this crazy world of wrestling?
Kevin Kleinrock hitting 8 for 8 at the casino, Cathedral City. The 8th show sold out, Viva la Lucha, which is a special lucha show that they bring out there. Rocky Mountain Pro, of course, out of Colorado. You don't always see shows in Wyoming, so they're going to run a show in Cheyenne, Wyoming. I forgot if that was the city that GCW had tried out, but I don't think returned to. But Effie actually got a good reception there at the time GCW had run. 140 were in attendance for TWF as it raised $1,740 for charity. Not a huge thing in the nature of this gigantic business, but it's always interesting to see like how charities are benefit from running pro wrestling. Prestige Wrestling has a low floor seat alert. Of course, Mustafa Ali, one of the talents there, on February 25th. And a couple long form articles that I had saved on independent wrestling, but we'll save those for another day.
Nice. So let's wrap this bad boy up and head towards the plugs. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Two-Man Power Trip. Check the website, tmptempire.com. Lavie, what do you got going on?
Yes, and as I return to the screen, sorry, as I was looking at my notes, I think I lowered things at one point, but no one needs to see me. You just need to hear me. So follow me on Twitter, Lavie Marg, LAVIE-MARG. Check out my long-form articles on LionCubJobSearch.com. Check out our official business of the business partner, or we are their official business podcast, PW Ponderings, and we are distributed by the Creative Control Network.
All right. Thank you to John. Get the book Ballyhoo ASAP. Thank you, Lavie. Thank you, everybody out there, for listening. See you right back here next week for a little business of the business. We'll see you next week, folks.